In May of 2002, and for the first time since Fidel Castro took power in 1959, more than 11,000 Cubans demanded a referendum so that their rights would be recognized. I was one of the Cubans who signed and gathered the signatures required as per the Cuban Constitution to validate the petition. I was one of the administrators of the Varela project, and I had the privilege to submit the petition together with Oswaldo Paya and Antonio Diaz to the Cuban Parliament. But in Cuba, citizens are not allowed to express their beliefs, nor are they granted freedom of association. Economic rights are still not being recognized, despite the cosmetic measures that have been taken that are more concessions and not genuine measures, even if they are announced to the rest of the world. They are little more than a phony trick to keep the ruling caste in power, in fact. In Cuba, there are no free elections, and what the Cuban regime calls a participatory process is little more than a ratification of 612 individuals who have been cherry-picked by organizations close to the dictatorship for the 612 seats in the National Parliament. And this explains why we, 75 activists and ringleaders fighting for the rights and freedoms of the Cuban people, were abducted and tried in a grotesque monkey trial, held captive in overcrowded, sweltering cells, along with alleged drug traffickers. In the 30 days we were there, we were only allowed to glimpse the sunlight once. I was constantly subjected to interrogation in freezing offices as an intimidation measure, and in a vain attempt to get me to confess to the infamous slander leveled against us. We were then transferred hundreds of kilometers away from our homes and scattered throughout the island, locked up in cells with common criminals. We were allowed practically no visits or communication with our families. Our correspondence was censored. In those years, we were denied the right to read the Bible or books on Cuban or world history. Many of us were badly beaten by our jailers. We were given little to eat, and the food was of poor quality. Insects and rodents swarmed over us, and the filth and stench and lack of hygiene made us vulnerable to all kinds of diseases. With time, the shameful conditions of our imprisonment improved somewhat for some of us, but for some of our comrades, the conditions of detention remained extremely harsh. In the end, many of us had no other option but to have our families, who were at the end of their rope, request that we be allowed to go into exile. Our families were also subjected to inhuman treatment in the harrowing conditions of the Cuban public transport system, having to travel hundreds of kilometers to see us, bringing us books, pens, food, medicine. Our loved ones were also ill-treated and humiliated by our captors. The regime's promises to change, for the moment, are little more than a ploy to buy time and consolidate their oligarchic privileges. If this is not so, then what about the supposed right to travel that still gives the Cuban police the final word about whether people can travel abroad by issuing or withholding their passports? It's merely a form of blackmail, another form of repression to defend the regime's interests. And whether or not they will be graced by permission to go, it doesn't depend on the individuals. It's the same story when it comes to relaunching the island's broken economy and farming industry. It is the state security forces that decide if a person can open a small business or rent a small plot to farm. Oswaldo Paya fought against this bogus change in policy. He and we called a spade a spade. He fought against what is just a means to perpetuate the oligarchy who are subjugating the Cuban people. This consistently forthright position of the founder of the Christian liberation movement displeased the economic military junta and threatened the interests of those within and outside of the island who are interested in gaining privileges and not in enforcing rights. This is why he was assassinated, together with Harold Cepero on Sunday, July 22, 2012, as he traveled with two supporters who had come from Spain and Sweden to learn more about what the Cuban people felt and wished. Yes, Oswaldo Paya and Harold Cepero were murdered. We knew from the moment the crash took place, through both the injured and the witnesses of the crash, who sent word to those off the island. We have corroborated these facts with the survivors of the crime. The regime is trying to gag them, even now, that they have left the island. They are being held hostage, blackmailed by the dictatorship, which is blackmailing democratic governments, and these governments are silencing the truth, a truth they were immediately made aware of the moment the assassination occurred. And that is why we are asking the well-intentioned people of the international community to help us set up an independent commission to investigate the July 22nd, 2012 event so that the truth, already confirmed by witnesses, will be widely known and acknowledged. On that fateful day, Oswaldo and Harold were visiting leaders and activists working for the Camino del Pueblo initiative in southern Cuba. More than 2,000 activists, mainly from the inland areas, from over 70 human rights organizations, signed this proposal, which is the response of democracy-loving Cubans to the attempts to introduce bogus changes that flout the people's rights while ignoring and defying Cuban nonviolent opposition. We want our brothers in democracy throughout the world to know this, to know that in Cuba, in the midst of the most terrible repression, people continue to struggle fearlessly, yet without hate in their hearts, to achieve true change, so that the day of freedom will come ever closer. We want to be heard, for people to rally to the cause of the budding civil society in Cuba, that although fragmented is growing in number and agrees on our fundamental goals: civil, economic, and political freedom, social justice, and free elections. These are the changes we are striving for, the changes that many Cubans have so generously paid for with their lives during the more than half-century dictatorships. No one party or government in the U.S. or Europe can have exclusive rights to enjoy bonds of solidarity with the Cuban people. National interests should not dictate whether or not the timely moment has arrived to show such solidarity. We do not need this exclusive type of hypocrisy. We want an independent nation to sincerely help us get back our sovereignty, a sovereignty stolen from us by tyranny, to help us by following our lead and our own vision for the present and future. We would like our friends from across the seas to walk along with us down the path that we have mapped and already treading, the people's path, the Camino del Pueblo. We are calling for a show of your solidarity with us in our quest for freedom. There are more than 25,000 Cubans asking for elections to claim their rights. Thank you.